All right, Eleanor, take it away.
All right. Well, I am going to try to do all those three things at once. Thank you so much for having me. And thanks for those of you who are here in the various formats. I am really excited to be here and to talk with you and to get kind of your take, I hope, on some of the things that I'm going to talk about and hopefully convince you that solving the problem of firearm injury is all of our problems and all of our jobs. You're saying I should do a better job with the microphone. See, it's a whole new old world. All right, so I'm Elinore Kaufman. I'm a trauma surgeon over at Penn, around the corner, and health services researcher as well. One of the things that I study certainly is gun violence prevention, every time I write a paper about this topic, every time I give talk about this topic, it's always going to be timely, unfortunately. So I did re-Google this again today to try to ensure that the San Jose workplace shooting was the most recent sort of widely publicized mass shooting. And I think that's right. There were a bunch of people shot at a mall, but luckily everybody survived, which then doesn't quite make the qualifications for being considered a mass shooting. The other thing that doesn't make the qualifications for being considered a mass shooting is this. This is my cell phone from a weekend of traumas at around the corner at Penn Presbyterian Medical Center. This is actually old. This was not this last weekend, although on Monday we did get what we consider a neighborhood mass shooting of 6 victims who came in within the space of an hour or two, right? So this is a big problem, a common problem, or persistent problem, and always a timely problem. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the United States, a little bit what's going on here in Philadelphia, maybe a little bit about how we got here, a little bit about how we might be able to get out of here, and I'm going to try to find some ways to ask for your help in getting us out of this ongoing crisis that we're in with firearm injury in this country. I don't think I included an official disclosure slide, but I will disclose that my data-driven biases are going to be on display. I think I'm going to be supporting everything that I believe with a lot of science and a lot of facts, but it's not neutral. I'm going to talk mostly about interpersonal firearm violence, community firearm violence. I'll talk a little bit about some other forms of firearm injury that are no less important, but are a little bit less my area of expertise and maybe need different solutions. I don't know. But I'll start with kind of the broadest and say there's nearly 40,000 firearm deaths per year in this country. And those slices of the pie are suicide, homicide, accidental or unintentional shooting deaths. And it's not a quiz. I'm not going to ask you to say which is which. But I think probably most people don't know that about almost 2/3 of firearm deaths are actually suicide. Most of the remainder are homicides. Those little ones, the little yellow one, they're all about 1 or 2% is unintentional deaths. The little orange one there, is deaths caused by police, and there's a little unknown, right? About twice as many victims as survived. So I'm a trauma surgeon, so I'm proud of this. This is my goal, right, is to move people from the little pie chart into the big pie chart. That's where I work, is trying to help people make it through their injuries, get a second chance. And these are the colors are the same, so the proportions really change quite a bit. If you attempt suicide with a firearm, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, you are very, very likely to die. Therefore, we don't see a lot of survivors of firearm suicide attempts. About 35-40% are assaults, or the non-fatal equivalent of a homicide. So that's pretty consistent. And then these numbers are hard to get for reasons, but about half of the non-fatal injuries are actually unintentional injuries. Some of those may be assaults that we don't find out are assaults, but it's a much bigger proportion of that survivors slide. I think this is important because, like I said, these are my patients and I care about them, and these are people who are in our families and cities and communities who are living with the consequences of these injuries. But I also think it's important because the strategies that you might need to prevent an intentional interpersonal assault, for example, might be overlap with what we need to do when we think about preventing suicide, but might not be exactly the same. What we might do to prevent unintentional injury might have a much larger effect on non-fatal injuries than on deaths, which would be important in its own way. So just some ways of thinking about it. What was not on there on those pie charts explicitly was those mass shootings that I referenced at the beginning. And this is a few years old, but just to show you that the vast majority of interpersonal violence in this country, one person, if someone's killed, it's one person, or two people, occasionally three people. Those mass shootings that bring this to our common attention are horrifying. They're terrible. They're not okay. They're much more common than they should be. They're more common in this country than they are in any other country, but they're still exceedingly rare. They're less than 1% of all the deaths. So really, it's 2/3 suicides, 1/3 individual, or occasionally two people homicides, right? So firearm injury affects us all, but it doesn't affect us all equally. So those numbers get small, I guess, but this is what happens if you sort it out by race and ethnicity, and if you sort it out by age, and if you sort it out by gender. So this is men and boys. This is a couple years old, but that's how data are. And that astoundingly tall peak in the back is Black men ages 15 to 34 who die from firearm homicides at a rate of almost 80 per 100,000 per year. The shape of this next graph is the graph for women and girls. It's the same shape, but it's an order of magnitude shorter. So this is a disease, and I think of it as a disease, and I'm going to keep talking about it in that way, that affects men much more than it affects women. It affects people of color dramatically more than it affects white people, particularly young Black men, as I showed on the last one. The picture is pretty different when you look at firearm suicides. The tallest peak here, it's still going to be male predominance by far, but the tallest peak here is in older white men. It goes up with every age group. You see a different pattern, kind of in each racial and ethnic group, with that other sort of notably tall peak in young Native Americans, right? Similar shape, not exactly the same in girls and women. Again, the whole thing is an order of magnitude shorter. So does affect us all, does not affect us all equally, does affect our communities and our cities and our policies in a myriad of ways. And unfortunately, after those nice downtrends that you can see, this is sort of a long time scale, right? Starting in 1968, you see some nice decreases, particularly in homicide through the 90s, while I was growing up. But when I sort of started getting into this field, we weren't really sure if there was an uptick happening, but every year that passes, the more clear it is that things are unfortunately getting worse instead of better. Again, these data are not completely up to date, so we can add on the last couple of years. And I imagine that what you see here in this 2020, these 2020 injuries and deaths in the darker lines is part of why we're here today. And this has been seen in cities around the country. Oof, that is difficult to see. But these are various cities around the country with their 2019 numbers and their 2020 numbers. And I don't think there's a single city on this chart where things are getting better, although you do see that things are getting less worse in some places, which is very interesting to me. But in the majority of places, and certainly here in Philadelphia, and this is from work that I was able to collaborate on, we see a pretty striking increase. This is in these little jagged lines are individuals shot by firearms per week in Philadelphia. This is through the first several months of the pandemic. And that blue line is really the stay-at-home statewide order. So I think probably a lot of people have heard that this is going on. It's going on in Philadelphia pretty badly. It's going on around the country. so that firearm homicides in Philadelphia, we had 402 in 2020 compared to, I think the number is 303 for 2019. And we had about 2,000 injuries, up from about 1,500. So it's a big deal. And we see that, unfortunately, on a daily and weekly basis at my job. These data that we were just looking at come from data that the city of Philadelphia makes publicly available and that anyone can look at and kind of get familiar with if it interests you. The Philadelphia Shootings Victims Dashboard is a great way of looking at it. Maybe not the most uplifting thing to do when you're browsing the internet, but very interesting to kind of get familiar with. And I kind of, just to further contextualize it, I think we talked a little bit about deaths, we talked a little bit about injuries and just their frequency, but their impacts are broad and their impacts are wide. Firearm injury affects not only the individual, physical health, right? That's what I deal with most of the time, but the emotional impact can be really profound, right? As can the social impacts on an individual, on a community, on a family, on a city, right? And this is just I've done this before, and I have not been able to really summarize what my esteemed colleague John Rich wrote in the introduction to his really wonderful book. So I'm just going to read it because I think it's a really useful way of thinking about the impact of firearm injury on an individual, on a place, on a community, and on sort of what it means. So I'm just going to read for a second. I have chosen to title this book "Wrong Place, Wrong Time" because a similar phrase is commonly spoken by injured young men struggling to uncover the meaning behind their trauma. It is a perplexing expression since most of these young people were not in the wrong place. Rather, they were in their own neighborhoods, and they were often engaged in their usual activities, playing basketball, hanging at a nightclub, or visiting friends in the projects. I believe that when they say, "I guess I was in the wrong place at the wrong time," they are reflecting on the randomness of violence. They are asking rhetorically, what if I had left home 10 minutes earlier like I was planning to, or what if I had taken a different street? This kind of reflection is normal for traumatized people who are desperately trying to rewrite the script that led them to violence. This expression should not be taken as a subtle assignment of blame, as is often the case when the phrase is quoted in newspapers or television news reports. A deeper interpretation from my perspective is that the wrong place is a community abandoned and divested of the financial and human resources that are needed for community residents to remain safe. The wrong time might reflect a political environment that can only see these young men as sick or bad rather than injured, or that can only see punishment rather than healing as the single remedy for violence. I think he just has summarized a lot of the really important issues that my patients face and that we face, I think, as a larger community in a way that's better than I could have. And I strongly recommend the whole book. Really fascinating. Anyways, I also, this is not a sequitur at all, but I failed to say at the beginning, interrupt me, ask questions, make comments anytime you want for the online people and the in-person people. I also, there'll be time, I hope, if I organize myself well at the end, but also in the middle is completely fine. Do you guys watch Queer Eye? Did you see this episode? It was a really interesting episode. I like Queer Eye. I like the new version. I didn't like the old version so much, but that's not the point. The point is, this is a photo from an episode that they spent with a young man that represents a situation that's all too common. So when I say that more than twice as many people survive than die after a gunshot wound, they don't necessarily go back to normal on any level, right? So this is a young man who was paralyzed from a gunshot wound to his spinal cord several years before this show. And, so the physical health effects can be profound and they can be permanent. The mental health effects are also profound and can be maybe not permanent, but certainly long lasting. So following up with gunshot wound survivors after an average of 5 to 7 years, nearly 50% had symptoms of depression. About as many had symptoms of PTSD. And this is a study from here, but we unfortunately, every time we kind of look, we see similar results. The social and economic impacts are also profound. The struggles that people face in trying to get back to work or back to school. Unfortunately, being a victim of violence puts people at risk for violence perpetration and for criminal justice involvement for reasons that I think have to do with the psychological trauma that people face, with the fear that people face, with the loss of what can often have been a fairly marginal economic status beforehand, right? The families and communities are suffering from constantly increasing grief and loss, right? The prevalence of violence appropriately creates fear in the people who are actually at risk. Maybe inappropriately creates kind of fear in people who are less at risk. But for people who are living in neighborhoods that are highly impacted by violence, the fear has all kinds of downstream effects, right? So I think the most about the health effects and what happens if you don't think that it's safe for your kids to play outside. One of the things that happens is that they have increased rates of obesity and diabetes, right? They have decreased rates of physical activity. They have a limited social sphere. They have all kinds of other consequences, right? That are maybe not directly related to violence, but that are in the downstream, right? Violence is also interspersed with and interrelated with the experience of intensive policing, which is one of many forms of recurrent violence and trauma that that people can experience. So just to say, the effects are deep, the effects are wide. But you are all business people, I think. So I think it's worth talking about dollars for a second to say that it's estimated that as a country, we spend $280 billion on gun violence every year. So each death costs us as a society around $270,000, and each injured survivor around $50,000. These are acute medical costs. These are criminal justice costs. And these are long-term healthcare costs. This is sort of separate from what we spend every day. Taxpayers, well, I mean, that's actually an overlapping number. Taxpayers and the government are spending about $35 million a day on healthcare. Businesses are losing $1.4 million a day of lost work time, and families are paying out of pocket $4.7 million per day in healthcare. And then there's also the enormous estimated costs of the pain and suffering that's involved. All right. So I think, I know I went into money for a second there, but I'm going to go back into where I was before and say, I hope that I have convinced you that firearm injury is a health problem, and therefore firearm injury is a public health problem. And like a lot of other public health problems, I think it often makes sense to think of things, and this is sort of a classic socio-ecological model of a health problem in which you have an individual who's affected, situated within the relationships that I was mentioning, the communities and the society that all have a part to play in the disease. And so when you think about the individual and you think about what puts them at risk for becoming a victim of firearm violence, you might think about their mental health, substance use, their access to education, jobs, and housing, that might have put them at risk for violence, the relationships that might be protective or that might add to risk that have to do with mentorship, peer relationships, social support, conflict resolution within a relationship or community, the way that families are engaged. Communities develop strong norms related to how conflicts are solved and to the role of violence, and those evolve, those change over time and are determinative, I think, for a lot of people. The economic opportunity that is available or not available to a community is huge, as are the strength of community relationships and partnerships. There's a larger society, right, that surrounds any individual, any relationship, any family, any community that's at risk for or that's suffering from firearm violence. And we, as a larger society, contribute quite a bit in terms not only of firearm policy, which is maybe the most obvious thing, and I won't be able to help myself from talking about it a bit in a minute, but also from our larger social policies, our educational policies, our housing policies, our financial policies, and from the way in which structural violence is institutionalized in many institutions. This is not a picture of firearm deaths. This is a picture of motor vehicle crash deaths. And this is an analogy that people like to use a lot. It's not perfect, but it does kind of show, I think, the power of taking a public health approach to what had seemed like an intractable problem. If you had talked to someone, early on in this process, they would say, drivers are dangerous, cars are dangerous. There's not a lot we can do about it. But through taking, not through taking cars off the road, right? So that dashed line is the vehicles miles traveled in this country, which just keeps going up, right? But thus go down. And I think, you could imagine lots of ways that might have happened, but it really has been an impressive story of data-driven change and of change that took to heart the idea that just because a driver is involved in every crash and just because driver error is sort of the most common cause of any crash doesn't necessarily mean that fixing the drivers is the thing that's going to work, right? Fixing drivers is hard. Changing individual behavior is hard. More on that to come. But you can design your medians. You can plant trees so that they don't obstruct turns or signs. You can have reflectors, rumble strips, and signage on the road. You can work on the context so that you're banning drunk driving. For example, you have a legal drinking age, which had a huge impact on motor vehicle crash fatalities. You can put seatbelts in cars and require them to be used. You can make car seats available, require them to be used. You can have graduated licensing, which is a big deal, actually. I have a 15-year-old niece, so she got her permit on her birthday 2 days ago, so I've been contemplating that one. And then you can change the cars, right? You have shatterproof glass, shock absorbing steering wheels, airbags, and whatever it is that they do with cars so that they don't explode the way they used to, right? Someone who knows more about cars can say what that is, but they don't do it like they used to. Drivers are not any better. Cars are better, roads are better, society is better. Can we do this for gun violence? It's not that simple, it's not that easy, but I like to look at this to say, there's a million different things you can do. That's why it takes us all. Another sort of model of looking at public health impact or public health approach is thinking about, this is the Frieden's pyramid, former director of the CDC, who has this pyramid where the things with the big population impact are down at the bottom and the things that take a lot of work are up at the top. So the up at the top, that's me. That's where I hang out, right? Trying to take care of one patient at a time for the most of the time. Clinical interventions, counseling and education. But like I had mentioned, one of the reasons I'm really excited to be here with you today is I think that you guys are living at the bottom of the pyramid. And that really nothing that I do compares to what would happen if we could change the socioeconomic circumstances that affect my patients and that put them at risk to begin with. So try to sell that to you in a couple of specific ways, but I hope that you will come up with ideas that are better than mine as well. So I'm going to talk about this I had some like complicated pictures there, but it's also, I think, worth splitting gun violence into a pretty simple equation of gun violence is made up of violence and it's made up of guns. They're not unrelated, but they can be thought of a little bit separately. So you have a conflict, you have a threat, you have some kind, you mix a gun into the situation, you end up with a shooting, you may end up with someone hurt or killed. If you have the conflict and the threat, and you don't have the gun, you might have a fist fight, you might have a stabbing. Do you know how much I love stabbings? You don't, right? There's still a reason you would, but I love stabbings. I mean, I'd rather someone didn't get stabbed, but we get patients. Something that's unique about Philadelphia is that the majority of our penetrating injuries, our shootings and our stab wounds are brought to the trauma center, not by an ambulance, but by a police car. This is a whole thing that I could talk about at length, but what it means is that we get very short notice and very short transport times and very little information. So oftentimes we don't know exactly what has happened to the person when they come in. And oftentimes we have people who are in pretty bad shape. And there is nothing that makes me happier. Well, there are. But one of the things that makes me happiest is when someone comes in and I think that they were shot in the heart and they were stabbed in the heart. They might be temporarily dead, but our chances of bringing that person back, or if they're not dead yet, our chances of being able to fix a stab wound, even in your most vital organ, your heart, nobody gets stabbed in the brain. So that's another good thing about stabbings. I'll go on about this, but means matter, right? So violence can happen, guns make it worse. But there's a lot that goes on before the gun even gets involved or at the same time, right? If there's people there who can intervene and diffuse that conflict, if there's places of refuge where people can feel safe, if there's other means of conflict resolution, right? There's other ways of getting off that pathway. There's a lot of contributors as well. People's emotional and psychological experiences of anger and fear, drugs and alcohol are a part of nearly every injury that I treat, right? People's experience of criminalization and all these things that add up to risky lifestyles that put people at risk of being a victim or a perpetrator of violence, right? The presence of guns that makes more people want to carry guns. But there's an enormous amount of potential protective factors as well. There's education, which is the silver bullet in a lot of ways. There's positive community norms, community efficacy, which is the sense of a community being able to make a difference for themselves. There's positive individual relationships. And so importantly, there's opportunity and there are options, because nobody, maybe not nobody, hardly anybody's first choice is violence, right? That's not where anyone wants to end up. That's not anyone's dream from childhood. That's not even hardly anyone. I said I wasn't going to really talk about mass shootings. That's hardly anyone's plan when they get up in the morning either, right? It's something that goes wrong. It's an opportunity that was missed. And it's an opportunity that we have to get people second chances. So in other words, if you look at all those things, all those orange and red things, structural racism and inequality are really at the root of gun violence, right? And that comes in the form of unemployment, that comes in the form of poverty, underperforming schools, criminalization and mass incarceration, large-scale societal disinvestment in communities of color, and large-scale societal investment in policies that hurt the communities that we have made vulnerable. Do you know what redlining is? Redlining is a term that I think gets used for lots of forms of discrimination, but it originally was these red lines or these red neighborhoods that were colored red on Federal Housing Authority maps. This is from 1937. And these were the areas, and they were explicitly racially determined, where the Federal Housing Authority would not insure mortgages, right? So it's a structurally ingrained way of preventing wealth accumulation in Black communities primarily. And this is a map of shootings in Philadelphia. It's not a perfect overlap, but it's not that different either, right? So the brighter red and orange colors line up really well with where we have, as a society, intentionally said we don't value the people who live there. It's not like a great note to pause on, but you look like maybe you were going to have a question because you're holding a microphone.
I can turn on the microphone so it could
Hey, you did it. You totally did it.
Intersect in the system. So I had a question more on the earlier slide, which is around schools. So like I'll date myself, but like we had teen pregnancy conversations and sex ed in school. Like, are there gun violence conversations that are happening in the school systems to help kind of mitigate some of the stuff on the side? Not suggesting we shouldn't be doing the stuff on what was the right side of your slide for me.
Whatever, all the sides.
Yeah.
Some, I would say not systemically. I think in some schools, certainly in schools around Philadelphia, and my partner is a public school teacher here in Philly. In an unfortunate number of schools, you can't avoid having those conversations because they're losing students. But I don't think it's systemically taught. I don't think it's necessarily taught in a way that helps people understand the root causes, or that there's various programs for teaching conflict resolution skills, which I think are valuable, or which I hope are valuable, but which I know have not been really thoroughly evaluated. I was thinking a little bit more about education in general and the power of education to transform a life and to provide opportunities. But I think both are important for sure. Yeah. All right, keep going. So I am going to talk a little bit, sort of the more interesting stuff is violence and the root causes of violence, but I'm going to talk about guns a little bit, right? And I mentioned this before, right? But I'm not mainly talking about suicide, but I think it is instructive to think about the way that means matter and weapons matter and that the nitty gritty of a problem matters. These are the proportion of people who attempt suicide with a given means who die. And firearms are going to top them all out at a 80 to 90%. And a lot of people might say, if somebody wants to die, if somebody wants to kill themselves, they're going to find a way. If it doesn't work the first time, it's going to work the second time, but it's not true. 10%, only 10% of people who survive a suicide attempt go on to die from suicide another time, right? 90% of people who get a second chance survive, have the opportunity maybe to get the mental health treatment that they needed. Because suicidality, suicidal thinking is a profound mental health problem for a lot of people, but the suicidal impulse is often transient. I think of myself as being in the business of second chances, of trying to get people through something so that they can get what they need. If you are having that moment, that transient moment, that moment where you are seriously wanting to kill yourself, and often for many people, those moments last less than an hour. If you're having that moment and a gun is there, your chances of dying, unfortunately, are huge, right? And this is, similar in assaults, right? And I mentioned this before, I really love stabbings. And this is why, because we see more stabbings per year in the United States, but the vast, vast, vast majority of people survive, right? There's a lot of versions of charts like this that might tell you that this, in one way or another, is a uniquely American problem. That we are the top civilian gun owning country in the world. At least we were in 2018. And this isn't, I couldn't get, or I didn't get an equal comparison, but these are firearm in red and non-firearm homicides in a wide range of countries from a couple of years ago, but the trend is still going to be there, right? So you can think in your own mind what you think is going to happen in a second when I pull the box off the United States, right? So we have more non-firearm homicides than a lot of countries as well. And countries are different, right? The United States is a special place in good ways and in bad ways. And we have an astoundingly high rate of firearm homicide compared to other countries, right? I'm not saying that turning us into the United Kingdom or Turkey or Switzerland, huge number of guns, separate issue, is desirable or is easy, but it is a way of saying, does it have to be this way? It doesn't have to be this way, right? Because having a gun in this home doubles your risk of homicide, triples your risk of suicide, makes you 5 times more likely to be shot during an assault or a home invasion. And in a situation in which intimate partner violence is at play, it multiplies the risk of death for the victim by 7, right? But there's lots of reasons that people do have guns in their homes, right? And gun ownership, firearm ownership can be really central to people's identity for a lot of reasons, for military affiliation, for sport, for collecting. The most common reason that people say that they want a gun in their home is for protection, though, right? And another way of saying protection, it's not protection from lions, it's fear of other people is the primary motivation for American gun ownership. And I was just listening to a great talk about this today, was also the primary motivation for people who newly bought guns during this pandemic, which is interesting. And I think when we talk about that, we talk a lot about people we talk about people in various circumstances, but I think the same is true of people who actually are at high risk for gun violence, including this. So I can't really include pictures of my patients, but this is from an NBC article from the other day. So this is a patient who could have been my patient. He wasn't. And this is what he said. He said, in Philadelphia, like, you need a gun to have protection, right? So this is a young man who at age 13 saw his father murdered during a home invasion. And at age 21, as soon as he could, he bought a gun at a gun show and he slept with it under his pillow. He had it with him at age 22 when he was chatting with a friend outside a laundromat. So he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Like John Rich said, he was in the right place at a totally normal time. He was doing laundry when three men approached, and he writes, he says, I could tell they were robbing me. Okay, so he pulled out his gun and he tried to shoot, but someone shot him instead. I don't know. I think everybody can tell, right? I don't love guns. I think it's possible to work to end firearm violence and also to appreciate guns. That's not me. That's a lot of people who I admire. But I do kind of I wish that people who bought guns to protect themselves, I wished it worked. I wished it didn't double your rate of homicide and triple your rate of suicide. I wish so many patients didn't end up in this situation where a gun is pulled and someone is shot and nobody is protected. So I think it's worth talking for a second, though, about what happens when you do have a gun in your home. It matters what you do with it. And people do all kinds of things with guns. They keep them on top of the refrigerator. They keep them in a drawer. Gun locks, cable locks are simple and cheap. That's that red thing. But if you have a gun for protection, that you may find that that's too cumbersome, right? Because you really value the ability to get to it fast. So that might make a lockbox much more practical for you. They're more expensive though, and that's something that we can work on, I think, as a community, right? I think kids find their Christmas presents. Kids also find the guns, and they figure out how to unlock them as well, unfortunately. So I grew up in New York in the 1980s, and I was trying to find a picture of this for this talk, but you used to have signs on all the cars that would say, no radio. Radio has already been stolen. Don't break my windows because you're not going to get a radio. Now you can't get radios out of cars, and also there's not a crack epidemic, so things are different. Cars are different, like we talked about already. But gun theft from cars have gone through the roof, right? And this is how, most guns, there's this thing about legal guns and illegal guns, but guns start out legal and then they're lost or stolen or sold down the road. And as states have liberalized their carrying policies and as more people are carrying guns, if you're carrying a gun, but then you get to a business where you're not supposed to take it inside and you leave it in your car, there's decent evidence that people are actually breaking into cars just to steal not radios, but guns, right? We have a lot of laws in a lot of states. This is just a very brief summary of some of the laws that have the best evidence for them. So child access prevention laws that assign liability when a child finds that Christmas present can have a positive impact on suicide for the reasons we were talking about before, by lengthening that time between the impulse and the weapon. Waiting periods have that same effect on suicide, maybe an effect on violent crime. I forgot to put the arrow in on background checks. Well, background checks reduce homicide and violent crime. I'm sorry about that. Domestic violence prohibitions might be helpful. Mental illness prohibitions that, again, try to keep firearms out of the hands of people who are at risk of having or causing a problem might be effective. Licensing and permitting is effective for both. Minimum age standards also are protective for suicide. There's a couple of laws that have been shown to have adverse effects on firearm injury, and those include stand your ground laws, which are a type of law that removes the legal duty to retreat. And I'm not a lawyer, and most of you probably aren't either, but in general, you're allowed to defend yourself, but you're supposed to try to get away first. Stand your ground laws remove that requirement and have been shown to increase homicide and violent crime, not the opposite, unfortunately. The same thing, unfortunately, for concealed carry. I did put the assault weapons bans at the bottom because I think this is a pretty popular policy and something that gets talked about a lot. And I am no fan of assault weapons. I don't think people need them. But I also, there's a separate question about what exactly an assault weapon is and whether you can ban them in a way that makes sense. But high-powered, high quantity magazine weapons, right? Banning them does increase their price on the market, so that's relevant to your interest, maybe. But the vast majority of injuries and deaths are related to handguns. Anyways, the other thing is that all this policy is made at the state level. Almost all this policy is made at the state level, but no state is an island except Hawaii, which is a collection of islands where they have very low rates of firearm injury, and Rhode Island, which is not an island. This is from the New York Times from a few years ago, but those arrows are guns moving from states with more permissive laws to states with stricter laws. We studied this a little bit, and the kind of, this is going to be confusing. But if you live in a county where, if you live in a state with strong laws, those strong laws are protective, despite those arrows. They're actually quite protective. If you live in a state that has weak laws, permissive firearm laws, it actually helps you if your neighboring states are stricter, which I thought was pretty interesting and kind of optimistic when we found that out in this study. But I'm going to stop talking about gun laws and I'm going to read again, because again, I tried to summarize and I couldn't do any better than Charlie Brannis did. So this is a picture of Charlie, who's a mentor of mine and a mentor of many of my mentors, and just a really great public health scientist and thinker who's been in the business of trying to prevent firearm injuries for a long time. I'm going to show a little bit more of his work in a second. But he says, you know, the public health, medical, and scientific research communities can no longer be at the mercy of US state and federal legislators, simply waiting for them to successfully pass or repeal laws as the only source of scientific and policy innovation to prevent gun violence in the US. This is a weak and unidimensional forfeiture in the face of a complex and intransigent problem for which the US public are rightly demanding innovative, effective, and immediate solutions. It's good, right? A scientific review of programs in 264 cities showed that every 10 additional nonprofit community building programs per 100,000 residents were associated with 9% reduction in homicide, a 6% reduction in violence. And these programs include things like community-led initiatives, youth development, career services, and the arts. Neighborhood interventions such as public transportation, environmental remediation, can reduce violence, including gun violence. Moreover, these interventions have co-benefits that go beyond the reduction in gun violence. And a fundamental aspect and benefit of many of these interventions, well, I'll talk a little bit more about them, is that with thoughtful implementation, they may also address the most basic upstream causes of gun violence, such as structural racism, poverty, housing inequity, unemployment, and educational inequality. Well said, better said. So we're going to talk a little bit more about interventions for violence, right? And if you want to learn more about what the city of Philadelphia is doing or thinking about doing, there was a blueprint and now there is a roadmap that includes working on transitional job opportunities, expanding community crisis intervention and community response supports, providing behavioral health services, neighborhood resource centers, and expanding funding of local interventions with the goal of connecting young people, engaging communities, coordinating services, and building safe and healthy neighborhoods. I just put up here their planned key measures of success, which are the idea that 100% of known victims or families will get services after a shooting. 100% of known individuals involved in gun violence or at risk will be outreached to, and gun homicides will be reduced by 30% and shootings by 25%. I would say we're, not on track for those numbers. But I do also think that the pieces that are in place are important, and I'm not going to read those. But I am going to talk about some interesting work that's been done here and elsewhere. So this goes back to Charlie, who I was talking about a second ago. And as it turns out, creating green space not only makes a neighborhood more beautiful, but also can decrease rates of violence. So I don't know if you've seen, as you go around Philadelphia, these sort of like random green lawns with a sort of, once I have started recognizing them, that wooden fence becomes pretty recognizable. But the city of Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Horticultural Society, and Charlie's team at Penn have worked for many years to convert much of the city's vacant land to green spaces. And impressively, they were able to study this in the most rigorous possible way. And perceptions of crime went down among neighbors. Their safety concerns went down. All crimes went down. Gun assaults went down by 5%. So not by 100%, but by a noticeable amount. And I think importantly, the effect was double in the neighborhoods that were at highest risk. So neighborhoods below the poverty line. And then there were all these co-benefits that he was talking about. So neighbors feel less depressed. You might think, I don't know if you think, but you might think that if you change one corner where people were, maybe it was a vacant lot, so it's a good place to gather, it's a good place to potentially sell drugs, it's a place where you might actually stash guns, right, under some debris. You might think that if one corner changes, the same thing is going to be happening on the next corner, right? But that's actually not the case. They found no evidence of displacement, which would be the word for that. And it's just really, really cool, right? And this has been done in this started in Philadelphia, so go us, but has been done in some other places around the country with similar results. And it's just so cool. So this is a thing that I think doesn't need to be done by the city only, doesn't need to be done by the Horticultural Society or researchers, but I think as people who are in business and are starting businesses, what's the relationship of green space to your space? Does it exist? Is it accessible? Is it welcoming? Or is it threatening? Is it policed? Is it causing displacement of what people were doing before? I think the more people who are thinking about the way that space impacts violence, the better. So I hope you do too. Here's another thing, right? I talked about all the different people who are at risk from firearm violence, but actually firearm violence is concentrated in very narrow social networks a lot of the time. So this is data from Newark, in which they found that about a third of homicides occurred within about 6% of the population. And here in Philadelphia, we actually have 2%, it's right around 2% of known individuals who were responsible for 80% of the shootings. This is also data from a couple of years ago, but it's impressive, right? And so there's some interesting interventions that kind of focus on that aspect of identifying the individuals who are most at risk and trying to help them, right? So one of those initiatives is called Cure Violence. It started in Chicago. It has formerly been called Ceasefire. A lot of things are called Ceasefire though, and it gets very confusing. But Cure Violence is the kind of this violence interruption model where there are trained community members who are credible messengers, who have shared backgrounds with the places that they're going to, who can respond in the moment to crises and promote conflict resolution, manage ongoing conflict, keep conflicts cool, right? They can also identify and treat, and by treat, I mean provide services to people who are most at risk of violence involvement. And then I think what the most important kind of longer term goal is to change those community norms that we were talking about towards different ways of conflict resolution, right? This has been evaluated a lot of time, and all this data is bad in the sense like it's all bad quality. You're recording this. I shouldn't have said that. None of it is perfect. Let me say it that way. It's really hard to evaluate this kind of program for a lot of reasons, but it all goes in the same direction. There have been versions of this where there hasn't been an effect. There's never been a negative effect. And there's been places around the world that have shown really impressive positive effects. So I love this, right? There's some other versions of this. Focused deterrence is sort of a policing focused version of this same strategy where you identify the people who are at most at risk. It's a little bit of a carrot and a stick combination in which individuals who stay on track are offered up job training and other types of service opportunities. However, they're also exposed to more intensive enforcement of not only violent, but also nonviolent offenses. So this seems like it works. It has worked in Philadelphia to some extent. Gang or group involved violence seems to be most easily improved by this. So it's interesting, and it maybe goes in combination well with other interventions. A really interesting version of this that is pretty new, this is pretty new data that's kind of I don't know, interesting. This is from the city of Stockton, is this concept of peacemakers fellowships, which kind of takes the cure violence model and does a different thing with it. Again, they use formerly incarcerated outreach workers. They do mentoring, they do conflict mediation, they do anger management, they do coping. They identify the most at-risk people and enroll them in something that they call an intensive peacemaker fellowship, where they do all kinds of wraparound stuff to support people. And they do this. They have a milestone allowance if they demonstrate significant progress toward their life map goals. Again, you're recording this. So again, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I think one way of reinterpreting that statement is to say that they're paying people not to shoot people. And I have no problem with that. I have no problem with that at all. You can go back to the $280 billion that we're spending on the consequences of people shooting people. And they saw a 21% reduction in gun homicides and assaults, 47% reduction in the area where they were working most intensively. This is totally new and really cool and totally remains to be seen if it can be replicated. But this is just to say that they really did find people who were high risk, and they didn't stop all the problems. 12% of their folks were shot while they were in the program. So not a perfect solution, but very cool. So this is a specific way of doing some things that I think we all might be able to do, right? Which is that they found and they invested in communities of color. They worked with intensively, they hired, they sponsored, they promoted, they engaged with people who are at high risk. And for businesses in a city like Philadelphia, businesses like yours, that has to include, I think, working with people who are formerly incarcerated, even if it's not straightforward. And understanding that that might involve appreciating non-traditional skills and non-traditional paths and providing maybe more intensive support than might be easy. Oh, there's the non-traditional paths, shoot. And also, finding ways to deeply engage with community organizations, community interventions with what is going on around you. I think I'm coming to the end. I've come to the end. But I did want to put a plug in here for a conference that's coming up out of Brown by my wonderful esteemed colleague, Megan Ranney, who is up there, who's been one of the leaders in gun violence prevention forever, and is also just really smart about stuff, including digital health. This will focus on this, among other ways of emerging from this pandemic. Thank you very much. We got 5 minutes.
And I'll just say a quick reminder to everyone who's on Zoom. We have about 14 attendees on Zoom right now. If you guys have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and we can ask them live here in the space.
It's good to say hi.
Okay, good to see you too. Hi, how are you?
Hi.
Yeah. I'm Bill Donahue. I direct New Heritage Community Development Corporation in North Philadelphia. I live on one of Richard Nixon's battlefields in his war on drugs, which as of this morning, we had not won yet.
Yeah, not yet.
No.
Not ever.
Well, there's a lot of money to be made here, so no, we're not going to win that war. And I was really taken by one of your charts that showed the percentage of people involved in the overwhelming majority of the violence.
Yeah.
So what I don't understand is why we're having an argument nationally about gun control when the problem exists with a small percentage of people. So instead of focusing on that, because this government, in my opinion, will not get these guns, that amendment will stand. And so the guns are where they are because of government policies. None of this happened by accident. What Nixon began turned into an $80 billion a year prison industrial complex that most of the people that you are talking about here support physically because they're in jail. Vanessa Harley is a friend of mine. She's in charge of the roadmap for the city. She's a deputy managing director. We attend the same church. And when she told me she was taking this job, I said to her, better you than me. So if we know that we have this percentage, I have 15-year-olds that are murdering one another in the middle of the day, literally, over nothing at a rate that is approaching genocide. And we're talking about all these philosophical, and they're dying in the street as a result of this government's policies. This was the economic development plan for North Philadelphia and other cities like it, South Chicago, Baltimore. When all the jobs went, this is what we had as the local economy. That's the problem. We never focus on the problem. We focus on policy after policy after policy after policy. But the problem remains. I think our focus is, this is a good place to start. But if you do that, then you lose the argument for national gun control. So it might not be so beneficial to do it. And if I sound a little cynical, I used to be a skeptic. I've graduated to being a cynic. Only because of what I see outside my window every day. Nonstop, incessant. So what are we going to do?
Yeah, what are we going to do? No, so I agree with you, and I'll kind of take us back to what Charlie Brenna said, which is I totally agree. We can't rely on our governments to fix this with firearm policy. The reason that I titled this All Hands on Deck, though, is that I do think there are a lot of angles, and I don't think there's any one solution. I don't think there's one thing that we should do. I think we need all of it, and I think we need all of it at once. I would not for a minute give up the pressure on firearm legislation, because I do think it makes a difference. I think there's strong evidence that it can make a difference, and there are places that have been able to make progress in that sphere. It cannot be the only thing that we do, and it's not going to be necessarily the fastest thing that we do, and I agree with you about that. So I think that takes us back, right, to some of those fundamental root causes of violence and what we can do on that. And you've mentioned one that I didn't really talk about, right, which is the way that we deal with drugs in this country. And it takes us back to those individual focused interventions, which can be intensive, they can be expensive, they can be maybe politically challenging, because it's not necessarily where everybody wants to focus their energy or money or time, but are incredibly valuable. So I agree.
We did have one question online. Would you be comfortable sharing your slide deck after this presentation? Also be posting a recording of this on YouTube.
I think I'm trying to figure out how I can best get it to you. But yeah,
if you send it to Emily and Angela, we can distribute it through our Hello inbox. We can have people email us and we can send it out.
Yeah. I didn't. Yes, I can. I feel bad sending you something without all the right references. Maybe it's my academic anxiety, but I'll add some stuff maybe first.
Okay. No worries.
Go ahead.
Hi. Great presentation. Thank you so much. Plus, it gives you perspective as well. I have a concerned question in terms of knowing about all these things. For a person coming from a different country, we have never heard of these issues. It's a big issue here, but having the knowledge of this and feeling helpless of not knowing what to do. I'm just concerned, not concerned, I'm just curious to see as a public health initiative or a public information initiative, is this information that everybody should know and something would come out of it? Or is this something that's more targeted where it gets just addressed to the situations that can result in such problems? I don't know if I'm phrasing my question right, but.
Well, I don't know. Maybe it's because it's something I think about so much that I think everybody should know it. I think it's one of the biggest challenges facing our country. And you're right, if you come from almost any other country in the world, you haven't been facing the same problem. there's a few exceptions. So yeah, I think everybody should know. And I think mostly because everybody has a piece to play, right? Like if you are, I assume that you're here because you're starting or involved in some kind of business, you're going to be buying things, you're going to be hiring people, you're going to be spending money and making money. And you can do that, to be completely honest, in ways that help prevent gun violence. And you can do these in ways that are ignorant of these kinds of challenges and may inadvertently make them worse, right? So I want everybody to be thinking about it in their work and in their daily lives. I also, people aren't perfect, and I kind of vacillate between being more cynical and not. But I do think if more people, I don't know, if people knew the people that I get to know through my work, if people thought about the victims of gun violence as the full humans, the valuable humans, the incredible people that they are, if people knew the families and, as you said, over nothing. So one of my most, something that I have the unfortunate privilege to do, right, is to inform families when they've lost someone, right? And a mother told me recently they shot him because someone got splashed with water, right? So I don't know. I think if more of us made it the priority that family has to make it, I don't know, make a difference. One of my wonderful colleagues, Jessica Beard, who's a trauma surgeon at Temple, as well as another colleague of ours, Jim McMillan, who's a long-term Philadelphia journalist, have been working on kind of trying to change how the media covers this issue in a way that's a little bit less maybe fear-focused and a little bit more deep. So I like to think that if people understood, it would make a difference, but maybe it wouldn't. I don't know if you'd agree.
I just echo. I mean, I thought your presentation was fabulous, and like the way you broke it down made it seem like we could be innovating around different solutions. So I appreciated your kind of take of it, and appreciated the fact that it was there's gun and there's violence. And so so often you hear this term gun violence, and I think we check out. You kind of say, well, okay, well, maybe it's not in my neighborhood, or it's not what I could do, or there's not things I can do around this. And the reality is I saw a million different solutions that we could all be doing. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
And it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be quick. But I think about public health, obviously, but I also am a physician, and I take care of one patient at a time. And any one patient that I don't have to take care of is a win, right? Is a win for that patient, is a win for that family. So, nothing is big enough to solve this problem, but also nothing is too small to make a difference.
That's fantastic. We don't have any other questions online, so would love to give you just a round of applause for this awesome presentation.